Everyone says they don't want Israel-Iran war. Israeli officials say direct war with Iran isn't the objective. Iranian leaders say they don't seek confrontation with Israel. American policymakers say preventing wider regional war is the priority. European governments emphasize diplomatic solutions. Arab states want regional stability. Yet every month brings escalation. Israeli strikes target Iranian facilities in Syria. Iranian proxies attack Israeli positions and shipping. Hezbollah and Israel exchange fire across Lebanese border. Houthi rebels disrupt Red Sea shipping. The rhetoric says restraint, while actions demonstrate escalation. This isn't contradiction or dishonesty. It's the logic of conflict nobody wants, but nobody can stop. Each side takes actions they view as defensive or proportional responses. Each response creates conditions justifying the other side's next action. The escalation ladder climbs not because anyone intends full-scale war, but because the accumulated actions make war increasingly probable, despite everyone's stated preferences. The proxy war structure allows both sides to inflict costs while maintaining plausible deniability and limiting direct confrontation. But proxy conflicts have their own escalation dynamics. As proxies grow more capable and aggressive, the distinction between proxy action and direct involvement blurs. At some point, an Iranian proxy strike becomes functionally indistinguishable from Iranian strike, and Israeli response targets Iran directly. The question isn't whether Israel and Iran want war. The question is whether the conflict dynamics they've created can be controlled, or whether escalation becomes self-sustaining regardless of intentions. Understanding why this war nobody wants keeps escalating requires examining the proxy war structure, the strategic calculations driving each side's actions, and the specific flashpoints where miscalculation could trigger uncontrolled escalation. The proxy war structure is decades old but has intensified dramatically. Iran funds, trains, and equips Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, various militias in Syria and Iraq, and Houthi rebels in Yemen. These groups aren't Iranian puppets. They have independent motivations and leadership. But they receive Iranian money, weapons, and training that dramatically increases their capabilities. Iran describes this as the axis of resistance against Israeli and American influence in the region. The structure allows Iran to pressure Israel across multiple fronts, while maintaining that these are independent movements rather than Iranian military action. Israel views these proxies as Iranian forces by another name. When Hezbollah fires rockets from Lebanon, Israel sees Iranian weapons fired by Iranian-trained fighters following Iranian strategy. The distinction between proxy and principle matters less than the effect. Israeli territory under attack from Iranian-supported forces. Israeli strategy is to degrade proxy capabilities through targeted strikes, while occasionally hitting Iranian assets directly to demonstrate that support for proxies has costs. This creates gray zone conflict where both sides are fighting without formally being at war. The escalation dynamics are inherent in this structure. When Israel strikes Hezbollah positions in Lebanon, Hezbollah retaliates against Israeli positions or civilians. Iran replenishes Hezbollah's weapons stocks. Israel strikes weapons shipments transiting through Syria. Iran moves more sophisticated weapons to Hezbollah. Israel conducts airstrikes against Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps advisors in Syria. Iran threatens direct retaliation. Each side's actions are framed as defensive responses to the other's aggression. But the cumulative effect is escalation where capabilities, targets, and risks all increase. The Red Sea shipping disruption demonstrates how proxy conflicts create systemic risks. Houthi rebels in Yemen, supported by Iran with weapons and training, began attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb Strait in late 2023, claiming to target ships connected to Israel. The attacks used anti-ship missiles and drones that the Houthis couldn't produce independently. The technology came from Iran. The stated justification was solidarity with Palestinians during Gaza conflict. The practical effect was disrupting global shipping routes. The Red Sea and Suez Canal route carries approximately 12% of global trade and 30% of container traffic. Attacks on commercial vessels made insurance costs spike dramatically. Lloyd's of London Market quoted war risk premiums at 0.71% of vessel value for Red Sea transits, an increase from typical 0.05%. For a large container ship valued at $200 million carrying $500 million in cargo, the increased insurance cost per voyage jumped from $350,000 to $7 million. Many shipping companies decided Red Sea transit wasn't worth the risk and rerouted around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, adding 3,500 miles and 10 to 14 days to Asia-Europe routes. The insurance market mechanics reveal the cascading costs. War risk insurance is separate from standard marine hull insurance. It covers losses from war, civil unrest, piracy, and terrorism, risks that standard policies exclude. Before Houthi attacks, Red Sea transits fell under normal maritime risk profiles. War risk premiums of 0.05% of vessel value were routine. A $200 million vessel paid approximately $100,000 annually for war risk coverage, allowing unlimited transits. The Houthi attacks changed the calculation. Underwriters at Lloyd's Joint War Committee designated Yemeni waters as high-risk zone. War risk premiums jumped to 0.71% per transit, not annually. A vessel making 12 Red Sea transits per year would pay $16.24 million in war risk premiums alone, a 24,000% increase. The economics became prohibitive. Shipping companies faced choice: pay exorbitant insurance, self-insure and risk total loss if attacked, or reroute around Africa. Most chose rerouting. The Cape of Good Hope, alternative, adds approximately $1 million in fuel costs per voyage and 10-14 days in transit time. For time-sensitive cargo, the delay costs exceed fuel costs. Just-in-time manufacturing supply chains designed for Suez transit face inventory financing costs and production delays. The aggregate global cost from Red Sea disruption is estimated at $20–30 billion annually in increased shipping costs, longer delivery times, and supply chain disruptions. This is the economic leverage that a relatively minor military force gains through strategic positioning and Iranian-supplied weapons. The economic impact ripples globally. Longer shipping routes mean higher fuel costs, longer delivery times, and increased shipping rates that translate to higher consumer prices. The Suez Canal Authority lost hundreds of millions in transit fees. Egyptian economy took significant hit. European manufacturers faced supply chain disruptions. The disruption wasn't catastrophic, but demonstrated how regional proxy conflict creates global economic costs. And the disruption occurred despite Houthis being relatively minor military force. The power came from Iran-provided weapons technology and strategic positioning on shipping choke point. Israel responded with strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen, a remarkable escalation given that Israel previously hadn't conducted military operations that far from its borders. The strikes were framed as self-defense against attacks on Israeli-linked shipping, but they represented Israel engaging Iranian proxy over 1,000 miles away, demonstrating how proxy conflicts expand geographically. Iran supplied more sophisticated weapons to Houthis. The cycle continues with no clear endpoint, except either complete Houthi defeat or acceptance that Red Sea shipping faces permanent additional costs. The Strait of Hormuz represents more critical flashpoint. 20% of global oil production transits through this narrow waterway between Iran and Oman. Iranian threats to close the strait in response to attacks on Iranian interests are long-standing. Iran has conducted naval exercises demonstrating capability to disrupt shipping through mines, anti-ship missiles, and fast attack craft. The strait is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Closing it wouldn't require defeating U.S. Navy, just making passage too risky for commercial tankers. Closure of Hormuz would create immediate global oil crisis. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq all export oil through Hormuz. Approximately 21 million barrels per day would be disrupted, roughly 20% of global oil consumption. Oil prices would spike to $150 or $200 per barrel or higher depending on closure duration. Global economic recession would follow within months. The economic weapon is so powerful that Iran can threaten closure to deter attacks without actually implementing it. But the threat only works if occasionally seems credible, which means Iran must sometimes take actions that risk accidental closure or miscalculation. The specific economic calculations are staggering. Global oil consumption is approximately 100 million barrels per day. Hormuz transits 21 million barrels daily. Strategic petroleum reserves in OECD countries total approximately 1.5 billion barrels, about 70 days of Hormuz disruption. But reserves are designed for temporary disruptions, not indefinite closure. Within 30 days of Hormuz closure, oil prices would reach 150 plusers per barrel as markets panic about supply. At 150 barrel, gasoline prices in United States would exceed $6 per gallon. European prices would reach 2 PLOs per liter. Transportation costs surge, affecting everything from food distribution to manufacturing supply chains. The cascading effects trigger recession within 90 days. Consumer spending drops as fuel costs consume discretionary income. Airlines reduce flights as jet fuel becomes prohibitively expensive. Manufacturing facilities reduce production as energy costs make operations unprofitable. Unemployment rises. Stock markets crash. Central banks face impossible choice between fighting inflation from energy costs or stimulating economy suffering from demand collapse. The 1973 oil embargo that triggered global recession reduced oil supplies by approximately 4 million barrels daily, 20% of what Hormuz closure would remove from markets. The Israeli-Iranian nuclear dimension creates mutual paranoia driving escalation. Israel views Iranian nuclear program as existential threat. Israeli doctrine holds that Iran cannot be allowed to achieve nuclear weapons capability under any circumstances. This drives Israeli intelligence operations, sabotage, assassinations, and potential willingness to conduct military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, despite enormous complications. The operations are deniable, but everyone knows Israel is responsible. Iranian centrifuges explode. Iranian nuclear scientists are assassinated. Computer systems are sabotaged by sophisticated malware. Iran views Israeli actions as acts of war justifying retaliation. But Iranian retaliation options are limited by desire to avoid direct war with Israel backed by United States. So retaliation occurs through proxies or limited direct strikes presented as defensive. In April 2024, Iran launched direct missile and drone strikes against Israeli territory for first time, framed as response to Israeli strike on Iranian diplomatic facility in Damascus. The strikes were telegraphed in advance, allowing Israel to prepare defenses. Most projectiles were intercepted. The message was sent: Iran can strike Israel directly, without inflicting damage that would require massive Israeli response. This creates dangerous dynamics where both sides are conducting what they view as defensive actions that the other views as aggression. Israel sees Iranian nuclear program as aggressive move requiring prevention. Iran sees Israeli sabotage and assassinations as aggression requiring deterrent response. Neither side sees itself as escalating. Both view their actions as necessary responses. But the accumulated actions push toward open conflict neither wants. The American role is simultaneously restraining and enabling. The United States does not want Israel-Iran war that would draw in American forces, disrupt oil markets, and create regional instability. American officials consistently emphasize diplomatic solutions and restraint. But American military support for Israel, intelligence sharing, and military presence in region enable Israeli actions. Israel can take aggressive measures against Iranian interests, partly because American support ensures Israel won't face existential consequences. This creates moral hazard where Israel pursues riskier strategies than it could without American backing. Iranian perspective is that American-Israeli coordination makes them joint adversaries. Attacks on Iranian interests or proxies are viewed as American-Israeli operations, regardless of which country's forces conducted them. This justifies Iranian retaliation against American targets in region. Attacks on American bases in Iraq and Syria by Iranian-backed militias are presented as responses to American support for Israeli actions. The proxy structure allows Iran to hit American targets while maintaining that Iran isn't directly attacking United States. The Saudi-Iranian rapprochement complicates regional dynamics. Saudi Arabia and Iran were bitter rivals competing for regional influence, supporting opposite sides in Yemen and Syria, and viewing each other as existential threats. Chinese-brokered diplomatic normalization in 2023 reduced direct Saudi-Iranian tensions, but the rapprochement is fragile and doesn't eliminate underlying conflicts. Saudi Arabia still opposes Iranian influence in Yemen and concerns about Iranian regional ambitions. But Saudi Arabia also doesn't want to be drawn into Israel-Iran conflict or see oil infrastructure targeted in regional war. This creates a situation where Saudi Arabia publicly supports Palestinian cause and criticizes Israeli actions, while privately hoping Israel degrades Iranian capabilities. Saudi normalization with Israel remains a theoretical possibility that would dramatically reshape regional dynamics. But normalization is politically impossible while Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues at current intensity. The interplay between Israel-Iran conflict and Israel-Saudi potential normalization means progress on one probably prevents progress on the other. The European position is pure frustration. European countries want regional stability, continued energy supplies, and peaceful resolution. European officials emphasize diplomatic channels and international law. But European influence over Israeli or Iranian decision-making is minimal. European economic leverage is limited because Europe needs Middle Eastern oil and gas, while Middle Eastern states have multiple customers. European military capability is insufficient to impose solutions or even meaningfully affect regional power balance. European position is reduced to hoping American restraint prevents wider war while preparing for economic consequences if war occurs. The nuclear dimension deserves deeper examination because it shapes all calculations. Israel possesses estimated 80-90 nuclear warheads, despite never confirming or denying. The ambiguous nuclear capability is intentional. It provides deterrence while avoiding formal nuclear power status that would trigger international pressure. Iranian nuclear program has reached advanced stages. Iran can enrich uranium to 60% purity, short of 90% weapons grade, but close enough that breakout time to actual weapons is measured in months. Iran claims nuclear program is peaceful energy generation. Israel and Western intelligence assess that Iran wants nuclear weapons capability, the ability to produce weapons quickly if decision is made rather than actual assembled weapons in peacetime. The Israeli calculation is that Iranian nuclear weapons capability is unacceptable. Iranian possession of nuclear weapons would constrain Israeli freedom of action, eliminate Israeli regional nuclear monopoly, and create deterrence that prevents Israeli strikes on Iranian interests. Israeli policy is to prevent Iranian capability by any means, including military strikes on nuclear facilities if necessary. The operational challenge is that Iranian nuclear program is distributed across multiple hardened facilities. A successful strike campaign would require extensive operations that Iran would interpret as existential attack, justifying maximum retaliation. The Iranian calculation is that nuclear capability provides security against Israeli and American attacks. Iranian leaders observed that Iraq and Libya abandoned nuclear programs and were subsequently invaded or overthrown. North Korea maintained nuclear program and regime survived. The lesson is clear. Nuclear weapons provide regime security. Iranian strategy is to reach nuclear threshold capability while avoiding provoking Israeli military action. The ambiguity about Iranian intentions creates deterrence without forcing Israeli preemptive action. The window for Israeli military action is closing as Iranian program advances and facilities become harder to attack. Israeli capabilities are formidable, but striking buried facilities requires massive ordnance that Israel has limited supply of and needs American approval to use. The Biden administration opposed Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, viewing military action as counterproductive. A future administration might be more permissive. Iranian strategy is to advance program as quickly as possible while international opposition is uncertain, creating facts on the ground that become irreversible. The cyber warfare dimension shows how conflict occurs below traditional war threshold. Israel and Iran conduct extensive cyber operations against each other. Israeli intelligence allegedly deployed Stuxnet worm that destroyed Iranian centrifuges in 2010. Subsequent malware attacks disrupted Iranian nuclear facilities and oil infrastructure. Iranian cyber capabilities have grown dramatically. Iranian hackers targeted Israeli infrastructure, including water systems, electricity grids, and government networks. The cyber attacks are disruptive and demonstrate capability without creating casualties or obvious war justification. But cyber operations create escalation risks. Successful attack on critical infrastructure like electricity or water could cause humanitarian crisis, justifying military response. The ambiguity about cyber attack attribution creates dangers of miscalculation. An infrastructure failure caused by accident or internal issues might be attributed to adversary cyber attack, triggering retaliation for event that wasn't actually attack. The cyber domain offers advantages for deniable operations, but also risks of uncontrolled escalation from misunderstanding. The question is what breaks the cycle. Several scenarios could lead to actual war. A successful major attack, Hezbollah rockets killing hundreds of Israelis, or Israeli strike killing senior Iranian leaders, could cross threshold where proportional response requires open warfare. An accident or miscalculation, an Iranian missile accidentally hitting American forces, or Israeli strike accidentally destroying civilian facility, could trigger responses that spiral beyond control. A deliberate decision by either side that current dynamics aren't sustainable. Israel deciding Iranian nuclear program requires military action, or Iran deciding proxy conflicts aren't deterring Israeli actions, and direct confrontation is necessary. The scenario that keeps regional analysts awake is the unintended war. Neither side wants full conflict. But accumulated actions, mutual paranoia, domestic political pressures, and alliance commitments create situation where crisis spirals beyond control. A Hezbollah attack kills Israeli civilians. Israel responds with strikes on Lebanon. Hezbollah launches sustained rocket campaign. Israeli ground forces enter Lebanon. Iran provides more advanced weapons to Hezbollah. Israel strikes Iranian Revolutionary Guard positions in Syria. Iran threatens to close Hormuz. United States moves military assets to protect shipping. Iranian proxies attack American bases. United States conducts strikes on Iranian military facilities. Iran launches missiles at Israeli territory. Israel considers strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Nuclear tensions escalate. At each step, actions are framed as necessary responses, but crisis escalates beyond anyone's control. The war nobody wants becomes the war nobody can stop, not because of malicious intent or desire for destruction, but because the structure of proxy conflicts, mutual threat perceptions, and domestic political pressures create escalation dynamics that overwhelm restraint. Both sides believe they're acting defensively. Both believe the other is aggressor. Both believe their actions are proportional and justified. The gap between how actions look from inside each system versus how they drive escalation from outside view is where uncontrolled war emerges. Everyone says they don't want war. Everyone keeps climbing the escalation ladder. The question is, when they realize they've climbed too high to safely descend, and whether that realization comes before or after the fall. The historical parallel to World War I is disturbing. In summer 1914, no European power wanted continental war. The July crisis following Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination created escalation nobody controlled. Austria-Hungary issued ultimatum to Serbia. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, supporting Austria-Hungary. France mobilized, supporting Russia. Germany invaded Belgium, implementing Schlieffen Plan. Britain declared war on Germany, defending Belgian neutrality. Within weeks, Europe was at war despite almost every leader preferring to avoid it. The mechanism was alliance commitments, military mobilization timetables, and mutual threat perceptions that created situations where each action was defensive response, but cumulative effect was uncontrolled escalation. Austrian leaders viewed ultimatum as limited response to terrorism. Russian mobilization was protecting Slavic ally. German war declaration was preempting Russian threat. The actions were rational from each perspective, but collectively produced catastrophe nobody wanted. Israel-Iran conflict shares troubling similarities. Alliance commitments, American support for Israel, Iranian support for proxies, create obligations that limit flexibility. Military plans and capabilities create use-it-or-lose-it pressures. Israeli strike plans on Iranian nuclear facilities have limited windows before targets become harder. Iranian missile capabilities degrade, if not used before Israeli preemption. Mutual threat perceptions. Israeli view of Iranian nuclear program as existential threat. Iranian view of Israeli-American coordination as regime threat. Create paranoia where defensive actions by one side appear as aggression to the other. The structure creates conditions for July 1914-style crisis where nobody wants war, but everyone's defensive actions combine to make it inevitable. The nuclear threshold represents the ultimate danger. If Israel-Iran war escalates to Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities or Iranian strikes on Israeli strategic assets, both sides face decisions about nuclear weapons use. Israel has never confirmed nuclear weapons possession, but estimated 80-90 warheads create assumed capability. Iranian nuclear program is approaching threshold where breakout to weapons is measured in months. In crisis where conventional war threatens regime survival, nuclear weapons become tempting option. The Israeli calculation in scenario where conventional strikes fail to stop Iranian nuclear program, except Iranian nuclear weapons capability forever constraining Israeli freedom of action, or use tactical nuclear weapons to destroy hardened underground facilities that conventional weapons cannot reach. The decision is terrible, but from Israeli existential perspective, might seem necessary. 1 or 2 nuclear bunker buster strikes on Fordow or Natanz facilities could set Iranian program back decades. The Iranian calculation in scenario where Israel launches massive conventional strikes or nuclear strikes on nuclear facilities, accept destruction of decades of nuclear program and deterrent capability, or retaliate with any available means including chemical weapons, biological weapons, or improvised radiological weapons using enriched uranium. Iran doesn't have assembled nuclear weapons but could rapidly weaponize enriched uranium into radiological dispersal devices, dirty bombs, that spread radiation over Tel Aviv or Haifa without nuclear explosion. The danger is that crisis dynamics compress decision time. If Israel believes Iran is about to achieve nuclear breakout, preemptive strikes might be launched with hours of warning. If Iran detects Israeli preparation for strikes on nuclear facilities, Iranian retaliation might come before Israeli strikes actually occur. The situation devolves into use-it-or-lose-it crisis, where both sides face overwhelming pressure to act first, because acting second might be too late. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis scenario, but with less time for diplomacy and more actors who could trigger unintended escalation. The question isn't whether Israel and Iran want this outcome. Obviously, neither does. The question is whether the conflict structure they've created over decades can be controlled when crisis emerges. The evidence suggests it can't. The logic of proxy wars, the imperatives of deterrence, the domestic political pressures, and the mutual paranoia combine to create escalation that overwhelms intentions. War that nobody wants becomes war that nobody can stop, because the system's dynamics are stronger than any single actor's preferences, and realizing that truth might come too late to prevent the catastrophe.